And to help answer this question, let's go to Genesis chapter 38 and read about the account of Judah and the death of his married firstborn son And that's found in Genesis chapter 38, verse 7. There's so much what we could discuss in this chapter, for this chapter is deeply messianic. But in this study, we'll focus on Judah's son Onan in verses 8 to 10. Onan was eliminated by God himself because he did not want to perform what was called a Levirate marriage. It was a Levirate marriage obligation. So let me explain. Three of the earliest codes of moral law are the Code of Ur-Nammu, the Code of Lipit Ishtaras, and the Code of Hammurabi. Many things in these codes are also in God's law. There's no plagiarism involved. I honestly believe these codes were given by God or to govern man, for man to govern himself. And because the Code of Ur-Nammu was very close to the time of Noah. Was very close to the time of Noah, and so was the Code of Lipit Ishtaras was not too long after that. As far as the period of codes are concerned, the Code of Hammurabi came about. It was after Abraham's time, and just a little bit before Judah's time. So. Many things in these codes are also in God's law. As I mentioned, I believe that God gave them for man to have a conscience about how to govern society, and so many of those things were right. Others were very particular and weren't passed over, very sociologically particular, and were not passed over to the law of Moses. But there are quite a few, and so in the code of Lipit Ishtaras is one of the earliest mentions of what is known as a Levirate marriage. It was promulgated by Lipit Ishtar, a ruler in Lower Mesopotamia who ruled from 1,934 years before Christ to 1924, or 1,924 years before Christ. The law was later incorporated, as I have mentioned, into the Mosaic law, this Levirate marriage, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. It's also mentioned or reiterated in the New Testament in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 23 to 33. And it's interesting that it's in the Gospel of Matthew, because Matthew was written expressly to the Jews, those that have been most familiar with the law of Moses. So they understood the application. It was the Sadducees that came and presented what was supposed to be a challenge about a man who was married and died without leaving children, a son, an inheritor. And so his brother applied the Levirate marriage custom or law, and he took her as a bride, and he also died childless, and it happened. There were 7 brothers that happened. You can read that in Matthew 22, verses 23 to 33. And so, but like I said, it's mentioned in the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 to 10. So that's what the Sadducees were referring. They were referring back to that law. That's in Deuteronomy. Okay, what is a Levirate marriage? Levirate means a husband's brothers. It's from the Latin levir, the Latin word levir, and it's called yibum. It's called jibum in Hebrew. Jibum. And plainly stated, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Will take his wife and procreate with her and have seed. So that firstborn child of that union would not belong to the living brother. It would be the son of the brother that had passed away with no descendants. And so that way both his name and his portion of the inheritance is not forgotten. More importantly, the widow is not left in the streets. In my book, Misogyny, I go through great lengths to explain how important this law was to keep the widows, especially the young widows, and just about all women married very young in our society. They would have been considered very young, and they would have been just horrible victims of prostitution and sex trafficking. But being, if they were not taken in by the family, if there was not a blood relative, like a child born to the dead husband, that the family that she married into very rarely would have taken her in as to be part of them. There was nothing that tied her to the family by blood. And the kings used to do that, give a daughter to another king who was a potential enemy, and then so that the prince would have a child with the daughter of the opposing king, and it's naturally assumed that he wouldn't declare war on his own grandson, and so they, in this way, they would have a pact of peace. And we can find this in throughout scriptures in various ways, and sometimes it became even distant relatives. We can think of the case. Sometimes I leave it as a challenging scripture or challenging thought or question for people if I'm traveling with them, and I'll ask them why, when David was running from Saul, King Saul, and he was hiding in the cave of Adullam, his parents came to him in the cave, and David was thinking, I'm not going to have my parents living in a cave with me, you know, with all these 400 men that were, some of them were real ruffians. So what he did was he took his parents to the king of Moab, and he asked the king of Moab to take care of his parents, and the king of Moab gladly received David's parents. And I asked people, why? Why do you think David would have done that? Well, of course, it's because of the bloodline that he had with Ruth. Ruth was his great-grandmother or grandmother, yeah. And so so Ruth was a Moabite. And so they take the parents there. They've probably got Moabite factions. They probably still speak a little bit of Moabite in the house. They have Moabite dishes that I'm sure they enjoyed as a family, you know. And David probably was, I'm pretty sure he spoke several languages, but he probably spoke his Moabite fairly well. And so he was able to go up to the Moabite king, and he says, well, you know my position. And the king was happy to receive his family, because he says, if David has been anointed king, he will eventually be king. And if I take care of his family, well, I'm in good standing with David, with this future king of Israel. And so that was part of the deal. So this Levirate marriage could have had long-lasting implications, or it was going to have long-lasting implications. So there was a very good reason for this law to exist. And so, plainly stated, once again, I'll say, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. And that was a good reason for it. Jibum is a form of Levirate marriage, and the Torah in Leviticus 18, verse 16, and Leviticus 20, verse 21, prohibits any marriage or sexual relationship with a brother's widow. You know, that's under normal circumstances. So there is a law that says, no, you're not supposed to go and mess around with your brother's widow. But jibum is the express exception to this prohibition. And the reasons, for reasons that we have discussed, both moral and material. God sustained this moral code as his law to Onan, Jude's son, and he was held accountable to respond accordingly. Now, where does this relate to this command of God, be fruitful and multiply? Well, if a law that God gave to man very possibly millennium after the creation, command to be fruitful and multiply. Here's a law that's only known as the law of the land. It's not a divine law considered in that sense. It's the law of some king or some moral order. And Jude, who lived before the Mosaic command, has his son Onan to marry Tamar and produce a son to his older brother and he refused. But look how God answered that. How much more authority than the word that came from the mouth of God? Because Onan spilled the seed, and he didn't want to procreate with Tamar. He didn't want to have a child with her because it wouldn't have been his. And God was so displeased that God killed Judah's son. Now remember, Judah is the messianic seed. It's going to come from one of his sons. Well, it wasn't going to come from Onan because he disobeyed a command that was just a law of the land. That God, surely God did put it about, but they didn't recognize it as necessarily a code from God, even though it was. So how much more authority did the word from the very mouth of God hold for those who receive the word directly from God? Okay, that is the Adam. The Bible doesn't mention anybody else until Genesis 4. Because, we find Adam and Eve, he created the Adam. Later, after the fall, we hear Eve. The name Eve comes in. That's in the end of chapter 3. Around verse 20. And so it doesn't mention other children because it's not relevant to the narrative. But in chapter 4, we have mention of children born after the fall because it is relative to the narrative. We have another better sheet here because it automatically assumes, the Bible automatically assumes that you understand that other children were being born and that those that were born were also procreating and creating more children. It automatically understands that, and you'll see that in chapter 4. So we have to understand or take this assumption. God gave the commandment, and man was obeying. If he didn't obey, it would have been sin, and it would have been a violation from God. You hear what he did to Onan. He didn't procreate according to a human command, and his life was taken. So, it automatically assumes that we understand that the first humans created and fulfilled that command that's mentioned in chapter 1, verses 28 and so forth at the end of chapter 1. This is why Genesis does not explain the existence of who would try to kill Cain or where he got his wife, because it naturally assumes that we understand that there were other people there. Some people really think they have a got you question. They say, where did Cain get his wife? Well, it came from one of those plethora, perhaps tens of thousands of other human beings that existed upon the earth. We'll get into a chronology of this, a proposed chronology, a little bit later, and perhaps in another study I'll deal more with that. But I'll concede that those who would have desired to kill Cain were most probably people who would have been born after the fall, okay? We're not counting those that were born before the fall because, like I said, when man obeyed, an indeterminate period of time passes because I do believe that man was successful in obeying for quite a bit of time. Okay, this only supports the point that the scriptures only mention pertinent incidents after the Bereshit. I'm going to cover some of the things that I have mentioned in this study in more detail when we examine them contextually in their respective chapters. So I'm going to go back and cover some of these things in much more detail. If you enjoyed the study, click like and subscribe. You can also ring a little bell so that you can receive a notification of any new videos that we have produced. Thank you. God bless you.
Available at Christian bookstores and online. Purchase it today.